Okay.
Here it is.
Well, good to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Bill. My academic background is historical musicology. I was in grad school, I was a historian, and my dissertation was on the history of music publishing in 18th century London. So I'm really into history. So you're going to get some history. Apologies in advance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with a quick overview of the standard scope, creation, implementation, and then look at some of the key scholarly publishing examples and speak to the history, challenges, and benefits of these particular projects. And some key strategic issues that come up are standards collaboration and connectivity, and community adoption and implementation. The standards landscape can be very diverse. Standards are very useful, but there can be so many of them, and implementations might not be consistent, and they can change over time. So we need robust community collaboration and coordination to ensure the success, because otherwise it will just be standards chaos. So as we look at publishing standards type, as you look at the entire standards landscape, there's an enormous amount of published standards, and they cover an enormous amount of concepts, and obviously a wide range in scope. But the categories that are relevant to scholarly publishing can include content structure and rendition, metadata and vocabularies, identifiers, as well as business practices and other things. But those are some of the prominent themes in standards relevant to scholarly publishing. So, some issues in the creation of standards. Having been on various standards committees and followed lots of other standards projects, these are what I see as key high-level issues in the standard creation process. So a first question, is a standard development pre or post implementation? Does it codify and or refine existing solutions, or does it define and enable new solutions? Is the standard development process reactive or proactive? Both are appropriate, it's not wrong, but it's just interesting that it can be different which one it is. And connectivity between standards is a big issue, particularly in technology standards. So how does standard A integrate with standard B and cope with future changes of the other standard? So MathML, it's gone from 2 to 3. HTML5 is about to become 5.1. Well, standards that reference those have got to cope with the fact that those other standards are changing. So coordination of compound standards can be a challenge. But connectivity is also really important because it supports the interoperability of our ecosystem, which is why standards connecting and not reinventing things unnecessarily is valuable. And also, is the standard rigid or customizable? How broad a range of implementations can be? And then looking across a broad range of standards, another interesting component in standard projects is what provision there is for validation, for conformance, which can help drive the success of community adoptions. Some standards communities have built validation tools and services, so epubtest.org and the EPUB and so on. And when a standard is a business practice, of course, there can be conformance certification, so is counter compliance, for example. So these are things that are just questions and issues when we look at the history of a given standard. Where do these things apply? So obviously, the big issue is the success of a standard is based on widespread adoption and implementations. And so what does that mean? What are the implementations? They can be internal at a publisher itself or a library or something, or it can be at vendors, services, and systems, or it can be inclusion in softwares and tools. And in some standards, the key for success is incorporation into other standards. And transitioning from current standards to the new one, can be a logistical challenge. So as I look at the history of scholarly publishing standards, it's an interesting and sometimes distressing that it can take a long time for a new standard to be widely implemented. This has come up as a topic on various boards and committees that I've been on. So the bottom line, from my point of view, is that we need to be collaborative and proactive to help move standard-based innovations forward robustly and more quickly, and that's the key strategic issue. So now on to some historic examples and key standards in the scholarly publishing world. So, the first example of a major standard relevant to scholarly publishing is one of our core content technologies, full-text markup. JATS, the Journal Article Tag Suite, is a rich and flexible vocabulary that has been widely adopted by journal publishers and has often replaced proprietary DTDs. There are multiple flavors of JATS and JATS usage in the community, which can be both positive and challenging. The standard includes 3 different profiles. Archiving and interchange, which is the broadest and most flexible, was created originally to support importing all previous content prior to JATS and for digital preservation projects, such as mine at Portico. The second is the publishing flavor, which is a subset optimized for newly created content. And the third is authoring, which is a small subset and not widely adopted since authors don't write directly in XML very often. The actual implementations of JATS can be versions tied to the specifics of the content or the system. So they're also publisher and or hosting platform profiles. So lots of flavors. And the JATS vocabulary is so broad that there's now a new industry initiative to define a specific profile of JATS to support scholarly content reuse with consistent markup. This project, which started in 2014, is called JATS for Reuse, JATS 4R. It currently includes markup practices for permissions, math, data citations, and is moving on to cover other key markup components. So the history of article DTDs is an interesting example of standard history. It's been more than 30 years since the first major article DTD standard, then in SGML. It's taken a long time for the community to move from proprietary publisher DTDs to a robust community standard for full-text markup. According to Bruce Rosenblum, the first 2 article DTDs, which was AAP Serial and then ISO 1283, did not meet the specific business requirements of individual organizations within the scholarly publishing community. ISO 1283 was very innovative, but it was very rigid, and so it was used by publishers primarily with proprietary modifications, so it was not a formally adopted standard. That was what I did for the University of Chicago Press. As a participant, I was the US tech rep to ISO 1283. It was striking to me that there was just not enough community experience being brought to the discussions at that time, because that was in the early days of full-text markup. The NLM tag suite, which came later, was much broader and richer vocabulary based on subsequent years of industry experience with full-text markup. But because of the biomedical focus and the politics, it was not widely adopted by publishers, but moving the NLM DTD to NISO as JATS led to robust community participation and much wider adoption. It's interesting that though the initial success of JATS was due to its broad flexibility, we're now to the point where JATS for Reuse is trying to streamline and reduce the flexibility. So just the history. So JATS is a strongly community-driven standard. As a NISO standard, it's in continuous maintenance mode. And on the committee, we get lots of questions, comments, and suggestions posted to the standing committee. And the committee participation is great. It's broad. Publishers, agencies, librarians, service vendors. We've got good community representation and participation. And JATS has become a lively community. We have an annual conference called JATSCon and so on. And JATS is now broadly supporting international usage as well. We have encoding for language alternatives to support translations, transliterations, such as Asian author names and multi-language text. And now we've had recently a JATSCon in Asia, which is exciting. So JATS as a standard has lots of connections. The JATS vocabulary obviously incorporates external technical standards and has also supported publishing standards and practices. But JATS is now being used to facilitate content and metadata movement across our community. So peer review systems, when they export metadata to pass on to a production system, some of them are now using JATS as the specification for that metadata, in addition to a content format. And production systems and editing and typesetting and passing the content onto hosting platforms in JATS format, and metadata tracking through to Crossref as well. So JATS is a big piece of our plumbing. Some of the challenges of JATS as a project over the years has been in supporting new industry initiatives embedded in the article. Originally, JATS was based on current publisher practices rather than creating new functionality from scratch. So when Orchid was getting started, I proposed to the JATS committee that we add markup to support Orchid, even though no publisher was currently collecting Orchid, because it was new, it was coming up, and including that in JATS. And we did manage to get that in there for version 1.0 to support publisher submission of Orchid metadata to Crossref. So at JATS committee, we collaborate with community initiatives, and we need to stay on top of industry initiatives. A current example of the challenge is linked clinical trials, a new Crossref service that may require metadata markup in JATS, or it may be okay with existing markup. Crossref has announced this new functionality, but the JATS committee has not yet evaluated how to support it. And that could potentially delay community implementations, depending on whether new markup is needed or not. Another challenge, in my opinion, is the potential need to improve the update speed. It was 3 years between version 1 and 1.1, and that slowed down some FundRef and Chorus implementations because JATS 1.1 added the funder and license metadata. There were drafts available, but a community practice is commonly not to implement the draft until it's formally approved. And so given that JATS is the plumbing of industry communications in metadata as well as content, maybe we need to move to more annual updates if there are new industry initiatives to support. The JATS vocabulary itself is so rich and robust that it's become the basis of a number of projects for other content journals. BITS, the Book Internet Interchange Tag Suite, was created for STM books by NLM in 2013. It added some book-specific elements, but used the JATS core robustly so that content in JATS and BITS would have useful similarities. JATS vocabulary was also used to create a spec for standards document. That began as an ISO project and is now a NISO project. NISO SDS version 1.0 is in progress, likely to be approved early next year is the committee goal. But these JATS components are being used in multiple content genre projects has inspired a new strategic discussion, not necessarily a standard, but a discussion called the JATS meta model, which is about defining best practices for shared vocabularies so as to support robust cross-genre content usability. So JATS is an important component of our scholarly publishing world, supporting content and metadata. An interesting history example is publishers moved from proprietary DTDs to a community standard that is very connective and collaborative. So on to another example, Crossref. Crossref began in 2000 as a community-specific implementation of what was then a new standard, using DOIs for article identifiers and reference linking. Crossref had become our robust infrastructure, as indicated in their current mission statement. Crossref has been important since day one, as this quote indicates, and a very collaborative community initiative. At University of Chicago Press, we had been working on direct links in our online journals to other publishers' websites, and we were very excited to see a new community infrastructure that would replace those proprietary solutions and enhance the content. So the history of reference linking is another great example of proprietary. Publishers were doing their own citation linking to other publishers, and we moved collectively to a community implementation, and it has been a great success going forward. Crossref is now at 80 million DOIs as of this year. They're almost 2/3 of all the registered DOIs. It has been a great success. Moving forward, Crossref is now supporting a lot of other functionality, expanded its scope, and evolved from basic citation metadata to include additional metadata. This slide is from a Crossref presentation at their annual meeting last fall, and talking about the difference between what they consider to be the basic citation metadata and the additional metadata, and supports lots of industry things, funding, authors, licenses, text and data mining, and so forth and so on. So in the history of this, there's as with many other industry innovations, a challenge has been the rate of publisher adoption and implementation. Historically, the publishers who did internal implementations were first up. They were often in the pilots of these projects. And then vendor implementations were next up, supporting the broad community and so on. But moving from pilot to community can be a long tail. And now that Crossref has both their core DOI functionality and all these other functionalities, it's become multiple implementation tasks. And it's not all happening uniformly adopted. And so Crossref, at their annual meeting last fall, was announcing that they are going to be doing publisher participation reporting as a way to highlight and encourage the best practice of complete metadata for participating publishers. Lots of innovations at Crossref. At the annual meeting last November, it was awesome, and I think the most exciting in the 15 years of Crossref, my personal opinion, of course. Lots of recent and exciting things that Crossref has done and that are great examples of industry collaboration. The Orchid integration, their support for preprint DOIs and early content registration, which will expand the usefulness of DOIs in the article lifecycle, and their new projects, which are upcoming, which is the usage logging and event trackers, and the linked clinical trials, which I already mentioned, and eventually adding institutional identifiers. And so some of these, a few of them, not all of them, will require support in JATS. Institutional identifiers are already in the JATS markup, so we won't have to do a new release to support that. So the history of Crossref has been a dramatic evolution from a single solution to a robust and important community infrastructure and innovations going forward. Very exciting. So another amusing example of how things go from publisher proprietary to community and industry standards was funder identifiers and funding metadata. This was originally called FundRef. It's now the Crossref Open Funder Registry. And it's been an interesting collaboration because it's not just publishers, it also includes funding agencies. Before this initiative began, there had been publishers doing proprietary implementations of funding metadata. At AIP Publishing, we had been collecting funding metadata since the late 1990s. We started with 2 key funders, and over the years it expanded to 34 funders common in the AIP publications. So that project was a great experience in funding metadata collection, but it did not create a comprehensive vocabulary as it was discipline specific. Elsevier had been collecting funding metadata for just a few years before FundRef, but given the range of their publications, they'd built a much broader list of funders. So as part of the FundRef initiative, Elsevier shared their registry and their expertise with Crossref to support this community project. The Crossref Open Funder Registry has expanded from 4,000 entries to currently over 12,000, and some funding agencies have provided feedback to update their entries in the registry. So this is broadly collaborative. We added support for funding markup to JATS 1.1 to facilitate the submission to Crossref. Because of the JATS version release timing, some publishers and hosting vendors are just now rolling out JATS 1.1 and their funding metadata submission. So, amusing, this is the deposit growth rate. As with many new initiatives, it can take at least 2 years to get going strongly. And this, because Crossref's metadata is public information, I was able to graph it, what their stats are. So for first 2 years, there were almost no, very small rate of submissions, and then it grew to a solid quantity in year 3. The spike in there is back data, retroactive data being supplied by Elsevier and ACS and Hindawi and IEEE. And the little bump in month 1, that was AIP supplying all of our back metadata to get the project started. But if you did this kind of stats from many industrial initiatives, you will see at least 2 years of very slow adoption before things start taking off. which is an issue for us as we need to deploy innovation to support scholarly publishing. But anyway, so the FundRef data has increased and is becoming more widely adopted, and is yet another interesting history. So another brief example of proprietary solutions moving to community solutions is Orchid personal identifiers. This is another example where CrossRef is collaborating across the community, and there were proprietary researcher IDs and things, but Orchid is an open and community initiative. And so it's, 2012, by 16, it had gone from 0 to 2.2 million. And now that publishers and funders are starting to require ORCIDs from authors, this is really moving forward. And the most exciting thing to me is that as of last fall, CrossRef has finally got its link to Orchid working so that publishers submitted Orchid metadata gets then added to the author's profiles via CrossRef so from JATS to CrossRef to Orchid, which is industry collaboration to add value to the community. So, moving on to Chorus. Chorus is a standard-based business practice in sense, the clearinghouse of open research of the United States. It can be described as a community collaboration to accelerate adoption and implementation of standards. It's not a technical standard per se, it's more a procedural standard of recommended practices. But what it really is a business initiative to achieve community goals by requiring participation in what otherwise would be optional industry standards initiatives. Chorus connects with the metadata across the community. Crossref DOIs, the access to what content is stored in the industry digital preservations, connects to the funders and the funder grant information and to Orchid. And so it's a clearinghouse of information as well as open research. And so based on industry standards, and as new standards become possible, Chorus will be leveraging those as well. So a funny story in the history of FundRef and the funder initiative is early on when we were talking about setting up, the metadata for funding, the question was, should publishers do with the grant numbers? Would there be any way to validate a grant number? And that got discussed with the US government funding agencies. Could they set up an API so that publishers could validate grant numbers? And they didn't do it and weren't able to collaborate as aggressively as publishers can collaborate. And so there are some possibilities of linking to the funders, but it's not by grant number, but it's not a comprehensive solution yet. So, Chorus compliance. Chorus is about verifying publisher implementations. It has dashboards, it has auditing of member conformance, verifying content accessibility with automated and manual audits. So in effect, Chorus is a validation system. It has been an interesting implementation challenge. The Chorus requirements and recommendations are about standards adoption and implementation, metadata deposit, public access compliance, and content archiving. The Chorus project has been really interesting instance of community collaboration about implementation in something that I hadn't seen in other projects around the industry. The Chorus members share their implementation experiences with each other very positively and aggressively on the technical working group calls, webinars, and meetings, and we've collected all of that shared experience as to how to make this happen in the publisher implementation guide, which includes not just requirements, but also the shared community experience about how to make this happen successfully. And so that's been a great community collaboration and community communication, And I think a useful example that, for other projects, that getting people to talk about how they implemented this and sharing that with the community is of value to the community. So, crossing lots of boundaries, the implementation and collaboration and new and future things will include institutional and international. But the bottom line, in my view, is that it's built on standards, and Chorus has significantly increased the adoption by members' requirements and verification, and by collaboration on implementation. So, on to NISO. NISO is yet another important example of standards crossing boundaries and community collaboration. NISO's focus is on both publishers and libraries as members and participants, and communities for standards. As someone with a publishing background, it is great to see into the library world via NISO, something SSP supports as well, but it's a great collaboration. The categories of NISO outputs are well known: standards, recommended practices, and tech reports. And they cover a broad range of very important topics: business information, content and collection management, and discovery to delivery. And each of those topics has a topic committee that is very broad membership that represents across the community in positive ways. And lots of cool things happening. Current NISO initiatives include Altmetrics, patron privacy, bibliographic roadmap, and tracking link origins, and lots of exciting stuff. The fun one is the Altmetrics project, and they have done a lot on that. They've just put out 3 draft documents, which everyone should look at. They're out for public comment, and they are really exciting. They're on data metrics, about data citation and usage, about persistent identifier types in research, and it surveys a very broad scope of identifiers, not just DOIs and Orchids, but the whole, and then non-traditional research outputs, content beyond just articles and books. And so these are very broad and very interesting surveys of things that could be potential value adds to our scholarly publishing landscape. And as I look at these documents and these lists, I think, oh my goodness, this could be a potential something we would need JATS metadata to support. This is something that Crossref could facilitate the exchange of information. These are ways to enhance scholarly communication in interesting things. And some of this you can hear about tomorrow, because there's a session tomorrow morning on the Altmetrics project. So, the future of scholarly standards. Standards will continue to evolve, and there are lots of exciting new projects from NISO, from Crossref, and across the industries. But standards have become ecosystems and replaced proprietary solutions in dramatic ways. To make this happen and continue well, this community needs to be collaborative and proactive to support robust standard creation, adoption, and implementation. And given that technology is much broader than just scholarly publishing, we have to move quickly to continue robust enhancement of scholarly communication. And we also have to look outside our technology silo. So over to Bill, who will be talking about other silos. So, thank you.
Any questions for Evan before I get going here? Yes.
Come on to the mic. My name's Stuart Maxwell. I'm with Scholarly IQ. Been working on the Altmetrics piece, and thanks for the plug on tomorrow morning's session. We kind of got now to a sort of a code of conduct on that one. And I guess my question was about, once you kind of have towards an agreed standard, about adopting to more of a sort of a governance and maintaining that over time. Any sort of experience in sort of progressing that side of things?
I'm sorry, I have hearing problems. So
Okay.
I'm not following at all. Todd, is that something you can answer better than me? Yeah.
So I'll really say it again. Once you got to sort of some standards agreements, I've been working with the Altmetrics group, talking about sort of pushing or encouraging adoption through ongoing governance and growth of, once you get to an agreement, about encouraging the adoption on a wider scale and governing that over time. how to sort of generate that ongoing industry support to it?
That makes sense. I mean, it's, just because a standard is formally approved and is a formal document, there's got to be a good motivation for people to implement it. It's got to add value to them. So highlighting the value of implementing is what pushes things forward most aggressively. So
Okay,
it
great.
sounds like
Thank you.
that's what you're doing.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll see some more of that tomorrow. Thank you.